All right, recording is in progress, and for benefit of the recording, I'll say hello to everybody. This is Association for Rational Thought is the group, but we have Valeria is labeled Julie on your screen if you're watching, though she's the Julie on the left for me. She'll be speaking soon. Valeria is in American Atheists and Agnostics, right? That's your meetup group?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, cool. And she's come to give us a talk today. I'm going to read the little blurb we have on the meetup to introduce her. So, Valeria earned her master's degree in 2015 from First Moscow State Medical University.
It is a medical degree, not master's, but
medical degree.
Medical
Excuse me.
doctor.
Thank you.
That's fine. Medical doctor.
I appreciate that correction. And let's see, so she said during her time in medical school, she came to realize that science is more exciting than medicine.
Absolutely.
And so she's now doing her PhD in molecular and developmental biology at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center.
I already got the PhD. I got it in 2021, and I can verify this information because there's a lot of
documented.
So there you go. Yeah, it was right at the crazy year of COVID-19. So we didn't have any, like, even my thesis defense was just basically like what we have right now. It was via Zoom. Yes, and then we didn't have any ceremony for that, but I still got my diploma. So now I am a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Nephrology and Hypertension at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. But during my work, we discovered several genes using the technology called single-cell RNA sequencing, and that's when you first digest the organ into the single-cell level, and then you sequence each cell individually to see which genes are being actively transcribed in there. And we were comparing normal kidneys versus different models of disease, which I model in mice using surgery. And we discovered several genes there, and I looked at some of them, and I found that certain genes might also play a role in the brain disorders, particularly brain tumors. And I developed a huge interest in neuroscience later, and I decided to have my future research focused not on kidney but on the brain, because I think that that's a much more interesting organ. And also brain cancer is a devastating problem with very small survival and poor prognosis. And I think there is less factors which a person from their own perspective can modify in their lifestyle to prevent brain tumor versus preventing kidney diseases. The huge role in that is on the behavioral side of the issue. So you can modify your diet, you can modify your lifestyle, while in the brain tumor, basically, if you're diagnosed, and there is so little we can do. So I decided to refocus my research in the future. And that's partially the reason why I bought this book, which I'm basing my talk today on. It will be shown later in the website. It's kind of 250 years update of recent brain research to familiarize myself with what's going on in the field and learn basic concepts so that I can, in the future, be more productive.
Okay, well, sorry, my dog had a quick comment there, but that was a good segue directly into your topic. Go ahead, Sue.
Valeria does a lot better job of introducing herself than you do, but
what can I say? Yeah.
But, okay, before we get started, I just wanted to mention this is officially the meeting of the Association for Rational Thought. We are not officially an atheist group, although many of our members are. We do not express have a stand on religion. We meet the second Saturday morning of every month from September through May. Our next talk in May will be Dave Siegel, who I'll send out for those of you on Meetup. This is advertised in the Association for Rational Thought Meetup and the Science Meetup, and I'll send out, as soon as I have the official description, I'll put that up in Meetup. So, okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Okay.
So we'll hand off to Valeria and go right ahead and start off.
All right. Thank you very much for all these kind introductions. And I greatly appreciate your attention and invitation to present on this group. And I will start sharing my screen with the presentation. Can everyone comfortably see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
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 So we're gonna start showing slides. And so as it was said before, we are the organizers of American Atheist and Agnostic Society, which is a meetup group physically located in Cincinnati. And we focus on discussing different topics relevant to atheism and agnosticism. And of course, I try to make my presentations as science research based as possible. And this time we'll be talking about one aspect of progress in brain research, evolution of the human brain from matter to mind, edited by a neuroscientist from Netherlands, Michael Hofman. And the question is, two aspects of that we'll discuss today, because of course it's not possible to cover all of the topics of the book in one presentation. It will be first evolution and origin of the human brain, and particular area I would like to discuss today is the comparative anatomy and updates on that, on the modern human and chimpanzee brain. And the second part of the talk will be about what we recently discussed on the American Atheist and Agnostic Society meeting. It is the nature and origins of human consciousness, including definition, classification, questions regarding embryonic development of the brain, which is necessary to have and execute consciousness, and also evolutionary origins of it in the humankind. And the reason why I picked this topic is because, first of all, as I said before, I'm planning to continue my professional career in the neuroscience field. And also, I think these questions are of quite importance for general public and for scientists in the other fields, because it's one of the least scrutinized areas of the science, partially because modeling of the brain activity of humans is hard due to the fact that you have to use the model which has comparable intellectual capacities to the human. And I will begin from discussing recent updates on the time point when actually modern humans diverged from the most recent common ancestor. And according to this very recent paper, it happened about 5 million years ago when there was this most recent common ancestor, and then there were directions into gorilla and chimpanzee, and then one branch was to develop into the Paninis, which are chimpanzee and bonobo, and the other branch was to go into the hominins, the representative of which is modern Homo sapiens. And the current hypothesis goes as this most recent common ancestor, MRCA, had the features shared between the hominin and panin brains. And then later, these two sub-branches went down different pathways. And we will discuss what are the differences between the modern human brain and the chimpanzee brain. And the reason why why we're talking about chimpanzees is because there's just more knowledge about chimpanzee brain versus bonobo brain in the published literature.
Valeria, could I
Yes.
ask on that last chart, the dark brown versus light brown lines?
Yes.
I'm just curious what the difference is between the legend for the dark brown versus the lighter brown.
So first of all, I would like to say that what this is done, how this is made, is that they did DNA sequencing of several monkey species and several modern humans. And this brown line is the most recent updates. That's how we believe it happened. And the lightest brown line, so there is a variance, like for example, people in the previous research were giving a range that this most common ancestor was between 8 to 6 million years ago. But the most recent research, which came from this paper, which sequenced a large piece of data, came down that it's 5 million years ago.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Just a brief excursus into the brain anatomy, because I think it might be of help for everyone to just have a brief look at that. And that's why I'm presenting these pictures, which have different views of the brain in each of my subchapters. So we'll start from the frontal lobe, which is probably one of the most important parts of the brain. And we can see that in this sagittal view, it's right here. And this is also a cross-sectional view. We can see it from the top, and here it's from the bottom of the brain, like the posterior view. So just to remind that frontal lobe is responsible for crucial functions such as motor and also cognition. This includes executive functions, also known as decision-making, memory, attention, language comprehension, reasoning, social and moral, mood, personality, and self-awareness. And the research which compared frontal lobes of humans and chimpanzees found that, first of all, frontal lobes are larger in terms of their absolute size. By the way, when you do the size normalization to the body size, there is less of the difference, but absolute size of the human frontal lobes is larger than in chimpanzees. There is also more white matter in the prefrontal cortex, and I'll just remind that white matter, these are the parts of neural cells which are connecting to each other. Also, there is a higher number of gyri, which is known as higher gyrification, and you can see on the picture below what the gyri are. So we have, as humans, we have more gyri in the brain than chimpanzees do. And what is particularly important is that Broca's region, and Broca's region is a part which is responsible for producing and comprehending speech. And we can look at it, it's labeled right here with this dark brown color. So Broca area is asymmetrically enlarged in the left hemisphere in the humans versus chimpanzees. But another important morphological difference is inferior frontal gyrus, which is shown here on the image. And just to remind that the functions of this area are processing speech, language comprehension, and production. And the recent studies, which I'm using the picture from on that slide, demonstrated that panins, including chimpanzees, and Homo, including Homo sapiens, have different shape of that area. So in the panins, we see that it's kind of like crescent-like, while in the humans there is this branching. So that had been observed many times in the past and confirmed by this recent research in 2014. There is another important distinction between human brain and chimpanzee brain, and it comes from the occipital lobe. And again, a short excursus in anatomy. Occipital lobe is the most posterior area of the brain. It's shown here in this bluish color, and here in the cross sagittal section. And here we can see these two occipital lobes. From the top view of the brain, we can't see it from the bottom because it's obscured by the cerebellum, which is responsible for movement coordination and balance and orientation in space, which you can see right here. But back to the question, occipital lobe is responsible for visuospatial processing, which is a very important function. Basically, it's distance and depth perception, color determination, object and face recognition, and also visual memory formation. And there was a research done in comparing chimpanzee occipital lobe versus two samples in the two human samples, and they found that in chimpanzee these occipital lobes are larger, and also the sulcus, which separates occipital lobes from the other lobes, is located more anteriorly in chimpanzee and more posteriorly in the humans. So that's another important distinction. There is also a difference in the shape. So of course, as evolution happened, the size of the skull generally and the brain was increasing, as we can see here on these image: rhesus monkey, then chimpanzee, and then human. And in the humans, brain has more orbital shape, while in chimpanzee it's more anterolaterally elongated. And I was also fascinated to find this other data from the recent paper in Science, which compares on the left a human brain versus Neanderthal brain on the right. And we can see that even in Neanderthals, the brain shape difference is still observed, because it's also more posterior, anterior, more elongated from the frontal to the posterior side, and less circular and globular than in the modern humans. So these are main differences in the areas responsible for what we would call cognition. And there are other differences in particularly the development. So human brain develops slower than in the chimpanzees, and the development of the white matter in the prefrontal cortex also takes more time than it does in the chimpanzee. So that was the part regarding the morphological differences. And now I would like to proceed to the next part of our discussion, which will be actually discussing what is the nature of the consciousness, because what mostly distinguishes us from not only chimpanzees and panions but other animals is this capacity for consciousness. And I would like to start from explaining the term. It comes from the Latin word conscientia, which is defined as knowledge shared with others. And we can differentiate two word roots in there, which stand for I know and with. And it's also defined as form of shared relational or social knowledge. So in the neuroscience language, there is three subdivision in what we see and define as consciousness. So first of all, the most basic one is the waking state, which simply means being awake. And I'm sure that everyone who attends this meeting today on the Saturday morning experienced that a couple hours before.
With some chemical assistance, yes.
Yeah, well, I had it with some coffee and minty tea assistance. Yeah, so, you know, when I was a child, there was this happy memory of mine when we were brewing the tea using peppermint of a very special breed. It was just in our garden, and I was never able to later find it in any commercial alternatives. So all of these tastes were too chemical, too artificial, or just not real thing, until I stumbled upon that brand, which just like evoke some of the neural circuits of my brain, which were formed when I was a child, and I just hammer since then on that tea because it's amazing. So yes, with some chemical assistance. So the other definition would be awareness of sensual experiences and physiological and psychological processes, such as thoughts, emotions, imagination. So that means that we can be aware of our sensual experience, which would be, for example, touching the hot plate, or any of the psychological processes I've listed. And the other sub-definition would be that consciousness is similar, it's just a synonym of the word mind, which means the ability to know, think, remember, believe, understand, and etc. And there is another term which is self-awareness, and it kind of goes parallel to the consciousness. So it can be divided into Awareness of being at the center of another human being's attention, which means self-conscious. For example, now I'm aware of the attention of the whole audience, which means that I'm being self-conscious in terms of being in the attention of other human beings, and also artificial intelligence of the computer. Awareness of one's own sensations, perceptions, and actions, which is self-detecting. Self-recognizing, which is ability to realize one's own image in the mirror, and that ability is the most frequently used to test consciousness level in the animals particularly, and in the patients who have some brain disorders which affect areas responsible for this. So self-conscious as aware of awareness, which means that we can be aware of one's own mental state and being able to be aware of it. And what is one of the most complicated forms of consciousness, which is quite specific to the humans, and that's why it's called sometimes phenomenal consciousness, it's narrative self-awareness. And what this means is that we can not only be just self-detecting, self-recognizing, self-conscious, but we can see life events from the past at the scale of time with the relevance to the present. So we can understand that, for example, something that happened 10 years ago happened 10 years ago, and we can present it and also present it in the form of autobiography. So all of that pertains the definition. And the next part would be about functions related to the consciousness and particularly its nature. So there were several scientists involved in attempting to figure these out. And some of these concepts will be presented here. One of them, for example, the most modern one, is comparing human consciousness to the concept of the most modern and complicated simulation systems. For example, one they compare it to is the flight simulators. And this comes from German philosopher Thomas Metzinger, that basically human consciousness is similar to total flight simulators, which involve simulation of the pilot, simulation of the plane, and simulation of the weather conditions around. And that basically means that when we plan to do something, we kind of create a thing similar to computer modeling inside our brains. For example, we think, what would be the consequence of our actions? What would happen if I do this? How would the environment and other people respond to that? And in this way, it is similar to the flight simulation. So evolutionary biologists believe that generally, consciousness developed as an evolutionary adaptation system. And in the beginning of human evolution process, it was not for complicated cognitive functions, but for basic things such as managing survival and reproduction, maintain homeostasis, for example, understanding when one is hungry and responding to that, and also orienting the world. And in the later part of the talk, we'll talk more about how evolutionary this concept developed and how it came to the state it is of today. But aside from all of these consciousness we discussed before, there are some representations which are not quite explained yet, and they include illusions, such as, for example, illusion of being in another person's body or out-of-body experience. We scientifically don't currently quite understand how this works, partly because it requires very complicated modeling, and the ability of animal experimentation for that is limited. So these parts are still to be investigated in the future. So there is also several characteristics of consciousness, and one of them stands for intentionality, which means that we can be, for example, aware of the cherry tree as an object in the world, and that's called third-person perspective. But the first-person perspective would be, for example, unique perception of the smell of the flower or the taste of cherries from that cherry tree. And with regard to that, we can separate three different aspects of consciousness. And the most basic one of them is cognitive, also known as noetic, and this comes from the Greek word, which stands for intelligence or intellect, and also ability to feel, which is closer to what people call sentience, and also the experiences, which can be sensory, interoceptive, and affective, and these constitutes the word qualia. And at the meetup, we had a large discussion about what qualia is and how can we basically test it, and that was quite interesting. So with respect to characteristics of consciousness, there's also three states. And the most basic state of that is anoetic consciousness, and that's basically also known as procedural memory, which means that, for example, we did certain procedure once, and the brain remembers how it was done, so that in the next time when we do this thing, for example, repair a car or prepare a meal or just words, it will be, this form of consciousness will help to do it better next time. And this is cognitive processing which can still happen when, for example, people are asleep. The other state of consciousness is known as noetic and also known as semantic. And that's an ability to recognize a person and distinguish concepts. And the most complicated state is autonoetic, because that's similar to the phenomenal forms of consciousness or narrative self-awareness, which we talked about before, which is the ability to remember a personal event and remember it on the scale of time, which means it being simultaneously aware of this event happening in the past and imagining it while being in the present.
Valeria,
Yes.
as part of your talk, will you get into talking about how one tries to test these various aspects and states in animals and versus and humans?
So I can that to talk about this in details, there would need to be another presentation, but I can explain that briefly. So it's done through the combination of two approaches. What we can do in the animals is lesion studies. For example, we talked before about all of these areas of brain. Like, for example, if we want to test what would happen if we damage this, what would happen if we damage the occipital lobe, what would happen if we damage parts of frontal lobe, what would happen if we damage temporal lobe. Then you do a lesion study. And what it is that you damage part of the brain in the experimental animal. In some cases, it can be rodents, because some of the brain anatomical functions are still shared. In other cases, if you need to do it in the higher animals, you use primates, and then you see what changes, which functions are missing. It also can be inferred from the tumor studies when, for example, we study brain cancer, and different forms of brain cancer affect different areas. So if you have lesion in one lobe, then certain functions are lost, and then you can infer from that what that means, like what this region was responsible for. So that's one part. That's when you can experiment and test. But the other part comes from clinical observations. That's, for example, when you have patients with stroke, patients with cancer, you can do imaging of their brains, see in which areas there is a lesion, and then infer from that which functions are lost. For example, lesions to the frontal lobe. If you have Broca's area damage, you would not be able, then the patient would not be able to produce comprehensible speech.
So I guess I was trying to ask, I understand what you're saying about the physical functions of the different parts of the brain. I was more curious about sort of the behavioral things. Like, I know they've done animal experiments. Do you recognize yourself in a mirror? You know, and they've done experiments to see,
we will talk
versus like, I can see how I might get my dog to do that. I don't know how to figure out whether my dog remembers 3 years ago when, you know, so I'm curious about that kind of evaluation of animals, whether you are talking about it here, or you can briefly. speak to how you try to determine those sorts of states of consciousness.
So we'll talk briefly about the first aspect of what you've mentioned, like recognizing themselves in the mirror. That will be discussed with examples, because that's doable and that is being done in the field. But I think the second part is the most complicated, and that actually pertains to what we discussed in the meetup when we were talking about what are the methods of detecting qualia, because what you're talking about, like what your dog remembers, is more, it's probably closer to the qualia part. And the problem with that, and we'll also talk about this later, is that the only way to describe qualia is via the speech.
Yeah.
So we can, because qualia, as we talked, for example, we can figure out if something detects the cherry tree on the outside. And that can be done with like vision studies, with, you know, their reaction to the sense, but we cannot figure out from the dog how does it feel about the tree.
Right.
But Gloria, this is Roy. Also, what you described as I think that's what was being talked about, the autonoetic sense, the
Yes.
ability to make comparisons or have memory from the past and how that determines the behavior in the present is
I think in the
also very difficult, I would think, in an animal study to determine its importance.
Yes,
presence.
because it would be the subtype of not of anoetic consciousness, which is like procedural and more mechanistic and repetitive. Like, for example, the dog can respond to the commands because via conditioning we can create reflexes in them, which would, for example, result in dogs responding to the master's voice or to the smell of food with certain reactions. But we cannot get from them the second two parts because we can't figure out if the dog is capable of remembering, for example, the day when it was trained to use certain space for example, a toilet as an event on the timeline. And I think that is currently believed to be one of the events which triggered higher brain areas development in the humans, because humans, for survival, needed cooperation. They couldn't survive without cooperation because, for example, there is no way how the human can hunt a prehistoric bear just by themselves. Today, it's possible with weaponry, but it wasn't possible like that in the past. So the only way how humans could prevail was to cooperate, and cooperation requires signaling, and it requires more complicated signaling than those which animals use via, for example, leaving their scents or labeling things. Like people needed some form of communication. And that's how the language developed. And when the language started developing, all of the brain areas responsible for language also started developing. So can we go from there, or there are some other?
Please. No, that was good. Thank you.
Yes, so we'll discuss some of that in the next parts. And what I wanted to discuss here is, so kind of, there are theories about why consciousness even developed in the humans and in the higher animals. And I think it requires some excursus in the natural history. So we know that most of the animal taxonomic groups, which are named phyla, they first appeared during the period known as Cambrian explosion, about 541 million years ago. And the reason why Cambrian explosion happened now are described as high oxygen in the atmosphere, which made it possible for more forms of life to develop and for forms of life to be what is important, larger, because that was one of the key things. So prior to that, most of the life forms available were small and soft-bodied, which means that they not only were small, but they also didn't have any external or internal skeletons. But as the body becomes larger, it requires more and more skeletal support, and it also requires signaling systems, which will allow, first of all, multiple complicated body parts to be connected to each other and to be coordinated. And these three new phyla, arthropods, chordates, which we belong to, and mollusks, developed complex active bodies with what is important, appendages, which were capable of producing movements with much more degrees of freedom than those which don't have appendages. And those are crucially important sensory organs and information processing systems. And to exemplify that, I present this example of one of the creatures. Its Latin name stands as Anomalocaris canadensis, and it belongs to the kingdom of Animalia, phylum Arthropoda, and class of Dinocoridae. And that has, as we can see in this schemata, a segmented trunk and swimming flaps with gills, tail fan, gut glands, and even the signaling system. We can see it has two eyes. Well, from this view, we can only see one, but from this, we can see both. Two eyes on stalks. We can see anterior appendages. We can see a circular mouth apparatus with many spiny plates. And this is a real image from the, I think it's Canadian Archaeological Society. So that's basically like it was stabbed to like to this stone, and we can see all of the features we discussed before. And that was one of the biggest predatory creature of the time. And we can see.
How big is that?
So there were images which I looked up, and if you compare it to the standing human, it would be from 0.5 to 1 meter in length. So that size would be 0.5 to 1 meter in length from the different species which were discovered in Canada. And of course, to coordinate that body compared to, for example, just something like this, or these single-cellular organisms or just multicellular organisms like algae, you need much more coordination system. And according to British zoologist Andrew Parker, actually, he believed that vision development was something which triggered later development of the cautiousness, because you first have vision, then you have these predatory skills which are helping the creature to survive, and this leads to development of defensive strategies by the others. And both predatory skills and defensive strategies require the organism to be aware of themselves to coordinate their action. There's another theory which comes from Michael Trestman, who is a philosopher of mind, and he points out that it was actually neural and cognitive systems first developing and connected to vision, which triggered development of the cautiousness and its functions. And basically what he pointed out was there was this basic cognitive embodiment, or BCE, which was intended to connect sensory information to active movement. And for example, those animals which have basic cognitive embodiment, they develop self-awareness because they were able to move autonomously in space. And what we know, so these are the theories of like pertaining to the question why this happened and which events might have triggered that. But from the morphological perspective, what is important for cautiousness to occur is this presence of these corticothalamic circuits, which I'll discuss later. And these are the structures which are needed to be present in the brain for the noetic cautiousness to occur. And what it is, this is a very basic scheme because this is kind of more complicated and specific for neuroscience. And what we have here is cortex, and we have thalamus, which is part of the midbrain. And what thalamus does, this is a part of the brain which has a lot of nuclei. They are motor and sensory. And this is a very important organ because it's like, if you compare it to the underground station, that's a station which coordinates the movements of the trains, which trains go, for example, upper to the cortex, and then which trains from the cortex go down through the midbrain and then through the spinal cord to the muscles. So when you have connections between thalamus and cortex, which are called thalamocortical pathways, the consciousness is possible because that helps to connect signals which all come from the periphery. For example, sensory signals, pain signals come first to thalamus, then there are the interneurons which are there, and then from these interneurons there are other pathways which go to the cortex, and that is what is, for example, required to have conscious perception of the pain. So any questions so far?
No, for me.
Okay, so then we can proceed further. And this is a photograph of the table, which was present in the book I used. And it talks about levels of self and consciousness in various vertebrate classes. And that correlates kind of with a complication, with how complicated their brain is. And it's believed right now that in fish and reptiles and birds and mammals, we can have noetic consciousness, but only in the Homo sapiens we can have the most complicated phenomenal form of it, which is called autonoetic consciousness. And just to remind what it is, it's the ability to understand the event at the scale of time and the ability to the autobiography.
And how do we,
Sorry?
and how do we know this? I mean, it's the same problem, is that in order to assess this in an animal, how would you be able to assess something that sophisticated in an animal?
And before you answer that, can you remind me what noetic is, so I know what you're talking about?
Yeah, sure. We can go back to the definition. So noetic would be semantic, and that means that it's ability to recognize a person and distinguish the concepts. And I definitely think that animals do have that, because I know that animals, for example, not even dogs, but chinchillas. And the reason why I'm focusing on chinchillas so much is because chinchilla is something we want to have as pets for the future. And I started doing the homework, and I already watched a lot of information about it from the chinchilla owners. And what they say is that over time, chinchillas start recognizing their humans. Not only they start recognizing themselves through the process of bonding, but they also start recognizing their humans and respond differently to their touch.
But so Roy's question, how do they know this? For fish, the ones for fish surprises me.
Oh, we will actually talk about that, and that relates to your question about the testing of consciousness. So that's right, my last bullet points. The fish species Lambroides dimidiatus recently passed the mirror test. And the mirror test, remember, we talked about as one of the tests of the consciousness, ability to recognize yourself in the mirror. The bottom picture shows that test being done in the mammal, an elephant. Elephants definitely have that, as well as dogs and cats. But surprisingly, this fish on the upper panel also was able to pass the test. And that's why I think they updated the table with it after the results of this research. But back to the second question, which was asked, yes, that's I wouldn't call it a problem, I would call it a feature, because the thing is that this form of consciousness is something which requires storytelling capacity. And storytelling capacity requires, it doesn't definitely have to be a speech. We know that in the prehistoric humans, it often would be primitive pictures, like what they would, draw on the walls, and that requires storytelling capacity. So we know that storytelling capacity is only present in the humans.
Well, okay, that's. I mean, if that's the way, it seems like a narrow definition. I mean, it once again, it can very well be the story you tell yourself, and that that with a human, you could easily describe and discuss because we can talk to each other. We have the ability to communicate in such ways as to explain our inner selves and how we're thinking or how we do things. But I'm not trying to be, I'm trying to be pedantic in the sense that I look at these things and say, well, only we can do this, but I think we don't really have a way of knowing at this point, do we, about other mammals? That's all.
I don't
Could
speak enough
elephants be
dolphin.
autonoetic, for instance? Or
Yes,
so-
I agree with you. I get what you're saying, that there is a way of narration, not to the exterior world, but to itself. But I would
Yes.
say, what I would object to that, also not trying to be pedantic or whatever, but just to say how I see that, is that at some point, internal narration would present into the exterior world, because like I've experienced it myself. When I was a small child, I just was creating poems in my mind.
Mhm.
And for a while, I didn't have a need to tell about that to someone. But at some point, you want to externalize all of these internal.
How about the way that some mammals teach their children? There are learned skills among some of the higher mammals,
But that fits into
rather than just instinctual skills.
But that fits into the first state of consciousness, like the processing memory, and like the one which we can teach. I think the way how animals teach each other, for example, how to hunt or how to avoid danger, more fits into that category. So of course, animals can teach each other skills. But what I'm wondering is, could these skills be pertinent of abstract thinking? So I think that this last form of consciousness, autonoetic, is also relevant to the abstract thinking, when you not just learn that, for example, wolf smells like that, and if you smell that scent, you run. Mm-hmm. But you can also think about what is a wolf in the world. Mm-hmm. Like what it is on the larger scale, why there are wolves. So I would think that the first form of consciousness is as basic as you see a gray animal with teeth and it smells a certain way and you produce a certain response, you run or you hide. It's like when the mouse would, lie to the ground when there are predators like owls or something.
But I wonder about something like a whale's ability to sing a very long and complex song, which I tread carefully here because I'm not really well read, but I believe there's some evidence for culture amongst packs of different whales, in fact, which can communicate over very large distances. Might they be, so to speak, telling stories that we can't interpret because they don't have appendages?
Yes, I totally think that species like sharks or whales might have their own ways of telling stories, and that very well could change our perception of the consciousness. But that one I agree with. But back to the question of teaching skills, I still think that teaching skills might be kind of on the small picture, closer to like reflectory reaction, when you see something and it produces almost like automatic, unconditioned reflex, and you just respond to that.
I don't want to dominate the conversation, but for instance, there's that classic example. I think it was a squid that to get to a prey in a bottle, realized it had to take the cork out. Things like that seem rather abstract in concept and in their thinking. And I mean, I think there's some evidence, there's been some evidence, not a lot of cases, but some evidence for what we might call abstract thinking in animals as well.
Yes, I wouldn't disagree with that. I also can give another example, again, from the chinchilla squad, that sometimes they figure out how to open their crate. Like sometimes they designed, I mean, we saw a lot of that stuff. So one of the story was that the chinchilla managed to escape from its cage during the night. And the way it did it was it just managed to open the lock. But, at some point, I also question, so, okay, it might come from the abstract thinking. but it also might come from random attempts, because I would say if I randomly try, I have no idea how to fix cars. But if I keep trying for the whole night, I might accidentally stumble on the solution. And that wouldn't come from me reading a book about how cars work, what is the engine, and how it needs to be fixed. But I can just be trying multiple things out of boredom or out of desperation. And as a result of that, I might accidentally click on the right button. That would produce a correct response. So I would say that to test this and to determine this, we would need to do a multiple subject study. For example, there would need to be many chinchillas from 10 to 20, I would say, placed in the same cage and given the same time to open it. And if they all start consistently figuring this out, being independent from each other, that would prove your point that they have abstract thinking. But if it's more from the random point, if the chinchilla just was like scratching on the lock and one attempt resulted in success, then that would be figured out by this experiment, because then it would stay random.
So we're done. We've come full circle. That's why I started out with asking was, how do you know that animals don't possess this sort of autonoetic consciousness? And I think the point was it's very difficult to do that. And
Yes.
Furthermore, in your example, chinchillas, for instance, there's certainly going to be a variation in chinchilla intelligence. And there may be some that are very bright and some that aren't. And you'll see variations there. I mean, even in that case, you'll probably see variations. Not every chinchilla is going to figure out perhaps a solution to a problem.
Well, that remains to be tested, but this variation might be due to like subspecies, because there are the chinchilla genus is not homogeneous. There are different subtypes of them. But despite having these different subtypes, they still have a lot of the fair share of similar reactions. For example, they all like to hide in tiny spaces, and that's because that's how they've survived. In the Chile, where they originated from, their method of survival was living in herds and hiding between the rocks from the predators. So even modern chinchillas raised in captivity, they still like to hide in fine spaces, and that's what I would classify as an unconditioned reflex, more like grabbing and Babinski reflex in the newborns, and other things like that, which is not taught, but which is just preserved by the evolution. And I would say that remains to be tested. I don't have an answer for that. What would happen if you place 20 chinchillas in the cage and see and would all of them be able to open it or not? To sort out the variability, you do all the types of readouts. For example, you increase the subject number, you do experiments independently, you do it by multiple groups. Because I can say that, for example, not all the mice react to the treadmill exercise similarly. Like most of them have to be trained to go on them. But back to the question about how do we know that animals don't have consciousness? In a way, it sometimes reminds me the question from theists about how do we know that there is no God? Because there is, like, we cannot sort out the absence of things which we don't know. And from the same perspective, I can say, how do we know that there is no flying spaghetti monster? Because like it can be hiding somewhere in the asteroid, right? In one of the moon craters. So I think it was in Harry Potter's books that like you can't completely with a full confidence say that something is not a thing until you prove that it doesn't exist. But from the other perspective, we have ways to determine if the thing is present or not. And I think at today's point, we know that animals do have forms of consciousness. They just might not have the autonoetic consciousness. And the reason why we think they don't is because they don't have the storytelling capacities at the extent of the humans have. But it very well might be that, as what you pointed, that these animals, such animals, for example, like whales, have other forms of storytelling capacities. And then that redefines definition completely.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. So just to remind others where we were in the conversation. So we were talking about one of the ways of determining levels of cautiousness in the animals. And one of them was a mirror test, which tests noetic consciousness. And to the surprise, recent research showed that a small fish, Labroides dimidiatus, shown here on the upper panel, was able to pass the mirror test like the elephant was. And that definitely broadens our understanding of cautiousness in the animals. So now I'd like to proceed to discussing more social aspects of what is believed nowadays to be the reasons why cautiousness developed in the humans, and particularly in Homo sapiens. So, and back to what we were talking about a lot, is this ability to communicate one's inner states, which could be described as qualia, through the language. And that is definitely one of the central mechanisms believed to be behind the cautiousness in the humans. And that, of course, has social and cultural dimensions. For example, one of them is human group living. And that's known that it was a feature since the times of hunters-gatherers. And not that it directly relates to the current conversation, but I recently read a paper from Science. It was talking about the history of prehistoric warfare. And the reason why I was interested in the topic is that I regularly debate Marxists, not only local ones, but, well, mostly local ones, but also sometimes those which are back in Russia. And you can recognize them by one of the very common concepts they present. And their concept would be that they would say that warfare came from capitalism, that warfare is a daughter of capitalism and nationalism. And wars became cruel and massive only with the development of capitalistic relationships in the society. And one of the examples they'll give you is they'll say that, well, look at the numbers of casualties in World War II compared to the previous warfares. And they would also say that, well, in times of hunter-gatherers, everyone was just living in the Garden of Eden and just collecting apples, and no one was fighting another one. So I decided to question that. And I know that there's a lot of academic books about this, but there is also this recent paper in Science. And what it studied was one of the sites in modern Kenya. And it questions the time point when there was still hunter-gatherers. The only update they had compared to previous times was that they already had pottery. So there were archaeological evidence of pottery on the site, which means that they already learned how to store food, but they still did not have like settlements and producing agricultural sites, like, for example, cattle and gardens, like they were just gathering and hunting. And there was this site discovered in Kenya, which had multiple corpses remains. It was near one of the large lakes, and all of the corpses detected on the site had traces of wounds produced either by what was used at the times as weapons, like, for example, obsidian spears, or from like heavy blows. And based upon how they were found and what injuries they had, the scientists concluded that this was in fact one of the first evidences of fight between the small groups of hunters-gatherers. And I just wanted to mention that because it was one interesting thing. And in debates, I often present this to the supporters of the theory that warfare only started when capitalism started. And I think that evidence of not full-scale military conflicts, but aggressive, violent conflicts in times of hunter-gatherers could serve as a good counter-argument to that. But that was an off-topic example. So to those who are interested, I can later send that article, which I recently found. But any questions so far?
I think your point about warfare is well taken, but I mean, it is simply a matter of evidence. There was not evidence of warfare until there was a lot to fight about. So, you know, it's hard to resolve the evidence. It's hard to resolve the limited archaeological evidence.
One could argue that capitalism made war more efficient, kill more people.
Right, more evidence of killing because we got better at it.
Yeah. There's a comment in chat suggesting it's another possible example is there's theories that, I think these are older theories now, maybe you can speak to this, but that Neanderthals may have been eliminated by warfare. I've also heard we may have, you know, screwed them out of existence, literally. Bred them out of existence, I thought was a more recent theory.
Yes, it is. And it actually does have evidence. And we discussed that in one of our AA meetings when we were talking about this Svante Pääbo, French genetical anthropologist who was awarded Nobel Prize for discovering of the interbred human species between Neanderthals and Denisovans. And Denisovans is another prehistoric human which lived in that cave of Siberia named Denisova Cave, and that's why they are called this way. So yes, I think that the current understanding is that Neanderthals weren't extinct by the war, that they were basically bred and crossed like this, and they might have disappeared just due to this factor, not because of the active warfare, because modern people still have some of the Neanderthal genes. For example, genes related to the vision, which means that there was, in fact, interbreeding between Neanderthals and other human species in the prehistoric times. But, you know, to the point of warfare being more efficient, so I did some calculations. There was this Albigensian crusade, and that's another topic we discussed in the AA meeting. Basically, it was a crusade conducted in the by the medieval Catholic Church and the northern French kingdom towards the southern France area known as Occitania. And aside from economic reasons, there was another reason, and it was that they practiced a different form of Christianity known as Catharism. And we discussed the dogmatic differences between the two. They both believed in Jesus Christ, just there were some differences in the dogmas. But back to the question. So it's known that there was up to 1 million casualties produced by this war. And this war happened in the 13th century. So the 13th century population of France was about 13 million. So 1 million out of 13 million, that's about 7.5%. And then I compared that to the First World War, which of course already happened when there was capitalism and nationalism. And to compare that to, in the First World War, there was 1.4 casualties on the French side. But the important distinction is that the total population of France in 1914 stood as 39.6 million people. So one can quickly infer that 1 million out of 13 millions is more than 1.4 million out of 39.6 million. So that's another thing, like really is that it made it more efficient. Maybe it made it more efficient, but I think it also made it less comprehensive because there was less fraction of the population affected.
I think that's interesting. There are many wars for which we do not have casualty figures because, you know, there are differences in record keeping or things like that. But the point is well taken. Some people think that the Mongol invasions of what is now Europe cost many more people than that.
Oh, not only think, I looked at the data and there are data on that. So if you, so there is a chart which compares casualties of World War II versus not just Mongolian, but two others. It's Taiping Wars Taiping Wars were closer in the time frame to the World War II than a Mongol invasion. Then there is Mongol invasion, which you mentioned, and then there was another very ancient war. It's called the War of Three Kingdoms, and it also happened in the ancient China. So all of these three military conflicts, they had very similar casualty count than World War II. And if you like sum them up together, they'll be much more pervasive than World War II. So yes, it's absolutely right. It's not only thought, but it's known that these wars like Mongol invasion, Taiping Wars, Three Kingdom Wars, they were nearly as bloody as World War II. And they didn't happen in capitalistic society.
Without prolonging the discussion any longer, there was recent work, I forget by whom, frankly, showing that the possibility of violence against any one individual has in fact almost monotonically decreased over time.
Yes, yes.
And with the principal exception of the possibility of nuclear war, that's very reassuring.
Yeah, I think that there was also a book by Stefan Pinker. I think he also, he also presented this similar data. I know because my wife read it, and there was an evidence there that violence overall decreased in the society. But yeah, possibility of nuclear war, although I think that this possibility is actually the only thing which keeps humans from wars like World War II. That this is, that it sounds scary, but in reality, it is the only thing which prevents humanity from just keep fighting like it was in First World War, Second World War, because the dictators like Putin know that there might be consequences to them, after which they would not be able to gather any fame, because there will be just nothing left of them.
I hope we're right.
Yeah, so back to thank you for all of these additions. And I just wanted to make this point because, yes, these hunter-gatherers lived in groups, and also it appears that they might be killing in groups. But so there was this British evolutionary psychologist, Robin Dunbar, who indicated that the size of these human groups was about 150 individuals. And that was one of the main factors contributing to the cortex growth in Homo sapiens versus other primates, because it's known that other primates, such as mentioned chimpanzees and bonobos, don't live in that large of the groups. And I made this little table to show which behaviors of prehistoric humans might have led to certain specific forms of the consciousness. And one of them was social behavior. So they lived in the groups, and that means that they needed to, for example, have thing as sphincter control, which, by the way, doesn't develop if you are not raised by the human society. And the so-called feral children, it's not observed. There also might have been observed forms of activity like dancing and singing, and ambulation, which is believed to start 4 million years ago. So
not to get scatological, but sphincter control? What do you mean?
Well, that means that like toilet training, potty training. You know, the new
I mean, I'm a little confused by that. Just about every animal, well, not every animal, but can choose when and where to go to the bathroom. Is that all that refers to?
Well, but the newborn doesn't have that. That's why we have diapers. They don't choose. They don't choose how and when to go to the bathroom, and potty training needs to be done basically with the same approach like you do this in the dog. You teach the child to use toilet instead of just using
in particular place.
Yes, in particular.
Okay, I guess I see the social connection.
You
there.
learn, you teach them to hold, like not to do certain things in public. But if you don't teach these things, they wouldn't come, because in those feral children, which we discussed in our other meeting, these functions weren't observed. They were just going by whenever they need. And that's basically like in the untrained dogs.
So untrained dogs, I was about to say, it's kind of interesting because untrained dogs I think, have a character of marking out their border territories using the smells from
Yes, yes.
and so is that a learned social behavior, or is that an instinctual behavior in dogs?
I would classify that as an instinctual behavior because they use it
So
in.
so you don't think humans have something similar? And I mean, that we may not have the same need to mark our territory, but we might want to, for instance, not, scatter around, marking, making other predators know that we're there, things like that. That maybe.
Didn't mean to
So-
sidetrack us so much, but
So I think
just was trying to connect that to social.
we might be talking to slightly different things, like how animals use their sense. It would be more instinctual behavior. But what we were talking about here is how people control their bowel movements. Like, for example, they wouldn't defecate in public, and the baby would learn how to use the potty, and they would learn to do it not because they need to like label that space, but because it's how human society has this.
Right. The comparison to me was the idea that someone, a human growing up without society, would therefore not have any reason to control their bodily functions.
They
That's
wouldn't
what
have
you're
any reason.
suggesting.
Yes, that's
Okay.
what I'm suggesting, and I'm basing my suggestion on the example of this feral child, which is described in the book by Douglas Kendland. It's called Victor of Aveyron. It was discovered in France at the times around, I think it was when the French Revolution occurred. And there was this French psychiatrist, Dr. Itard, who was trying to resocialize Victor, who was captured in the wilderness. And one of the observations he made was that he didn't have control, like he wasn't using any special space for the bowel movements. So that's what I'm basing my assumption on, that if you don't teach the growing infant to do this, they wouldn't, as you said, they wouldn't have a reason to do this, and therefore they wouldn't learn that.
Okay.
Yeah. So another thing which can be classified as form of social behavior is creating the tools, and that is dated as about 3 million years ago. And learning through the language, and also customs which were taught in the prehistoric societies, like, for example, clothing and cooking food, which dates as 1.8 to 1 million years ago, which started. And actually, this is another important thing which is believed to have contributed to the cortex development, because brain is one of the most picky organs in the body in terms of nutrients. And that's why it is so dangerous to have blood supply cessation, because when there is decreased blood volume, then the brain is the one organ which suffers first from ischemia. And that's why it's easy to lose certain brain functions in the case of bleeding. But it's believed that when humans started cooking their foods, definitely cooking, like thermal processing, helps to enrich more nutrients and make foods more nutritious. And that is one thing which is believed to have contributed to the cortex development, that foods just became more nutritious, and therefore there were resources for creating these neurons which require nutrient support. And that's also religious traditions which started, and the traditions of narrative, which might have contributed to the development of the consciousness in the prehistoric human societies. And another thing which is highly mentioned in all of these studies is the developed propensity to teach, which is not just like animals would instinctively teach their progeny to avoid danger, eat certain foods, but, for example, teach early cognitive functions, such as things which are voluntary attention and memory. And the way I would explain this is human survival required, at least like at the stage of transitioning from hunter-gatherers to settled living. But even at the stage of hunter-gatherers, you would need a certain plan. For example, you would need a plan to when to gather things, because not everything grows at all the times of the year. There are certain things which are not growing in winter. In colder climates, there are cycles, so you have to plan when things need to be gathered to have them later. And definitely when humans started living in settlements, then you definitely need more primitive mathematical skills, because, for example, you have to plan the field to be planted with crops to later harvest, and you have to learn how to count the months and hours to plan when things need to be planted to later harvest them. And the other point, which we already discussed and which the book is also making, is that if a child grows up with no human society, these skills are not developed. And this book referred not only studies by Douglas Kendland, which is an anthropologist and who wrote this book, Feral Children and Clever Animals, but to other studies as well. So,
if
yeah.
you could go back on the subject of teaching, I could be flat remembering this wrong, but I thought it was a study between chimpanzee and bonobo, and it was an observation that the chimpanzee did not teach. That if the child chimpanzee happened to see it going on, they'd learn it.
Yes, but
they
they
could
do not
learn,
teach.
but they didn't actively teach. But I thought they said the bonobo did. And maybe I'm flat remembering that wrong, but I thought that was actually one of the distinctions between chimpanzee and bonobo.
I'm not sure about that, because the book made a point that other primates, such as including both chimpanzee and bonobo, did not have this propensity to teach, but I would have to verify this.
Yeah, same here. I feel like I remembered it the other way, but I couldn't cite a source. So
Yeah, the book is
but anyway, the ability to teach, I find that as a teacher, I find that particularly fascinating. Yes, you can learn, but the concept of wanting to teach definitely
something.
has power to move a species or a society forward.
Yes, so back to that question, the book is edited in 2019. So at least some conflicting results regarding bonobo occurred since this book was published during the recent 4 years. Then I would assume that we cannot say that bonobos have this propensity to teach.
I feel like my memory's older than 4 years ago. I'll relay from the chat.
I'll check this. I look into that, and I think
I'm curious.
Yeah, I think at this moment, it's all I have. And the only last thing I wanted to mention was the reason why I talk about Sechenov. And I'm sorry if I sounded unhumble or bragging, but that wasn't my reasoning. I didn't say that because I wanted to brag. I just wanted to explain why that's part of the reason why I'm focusing on the neuroscience, because I actually graduated from medical school, which is named after this doctor, Ivan Sechenov, who wrote the book known as Reflexes of the Brain. And at the time being, that was a revolutionary study, which of course was met with huge hostility by Russian Orthodox Church, which was arguing for sentencing Sechenov to exile and jail him, and they were banning his books. All of that is so typical and so classical. But all of a sudden, after 6 years of research in America and doing kidney stuff, I realized that brain is more interesting. And in fact, I had some of connections to that, because basically I graduated from a medical school named after one of the pioneers of mechanistic psychology, and the person who actually explained how this stuff works. And that's my explanation for this. And with that, I'll finish, and I would be willing to take any questions and discussion, whatever people are interested in.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And yes, we do tend to carry on a bit after the talk ends, so we'll likely do that. But that was a very, very good and interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the attention. I know that some people tuned in later.
I'll relay at least one of the things. There was a little bit of conversation going on in the chat, but towards the end, they were talking about the teaching, I think, is what this was in reaction to. But Dave noted that the skills are not needed if you're alone. The skills
Yes.
emerge, those skills emerge as the need for them increases.
Definitely, definitely. And one other point I was planning to discuss was the timing. So I mentioned these thalamocortical connections, which are required for forms of consciousness to occur. So there is a stage in embryonic development of humans which describes how brain develops over the time. And we know that thalamus is absolutely required for any superior processing of any signal, because basically the levels are that you have peripheral receptor in the hand, then you have nerves which lead to the spinal cord. Then in the spinal cord, you have the first neuron, which is there. And then the signal through the pathways goes up through the spinal cord to that organ called thalamus. And then from the thalamus, it goes up to the superior areas of the brain, for example, to the cortex. And then it's being processed there. But the thing is that to have any primitive forms of consciousness, even those which are only present in the animals, you have to have thalamus formed and functioning. And we know when this happens, and it happens at gestational week 24. So before that, it's not only consciousness is not possible, but even the fetal brain doesn't control the basic autonomous bodily functions, such as, for example, temperature control. And that is exactly why fetuses after 24 weeks are called viable, because they have the organ which is required to control their body, to control the breathing, the heartbeat, without the maternal organism. And that's why we call them viable, because they can survive outside the womb, of course, with great intervention, but it's possible. So we can safely say that before gestational week 24, there is no possibility of consciousness, like, for example, feeling pain and all of this stuff. And later on, as the brain develops in the first year of life, infants have unconditioned reflexes, such as sucking and reacting when the mouth is being touched by either the finger or hairs which are present on the breast. And that's believed to be one of the adaptations to increase fetal drinking of the milk. And then later, after 1 year, they start developing conditional reflexes. So something which can be taught. And that's just one of the things which I wanted to mention, but I didn't have it on the slides.
It looks like Enrique may have his hand raised there.
Sand raise?
On Zoom. Enrique, was there if you have a question, unmute and go ahead and ask.
Oh yeah, sure. I'm reading the chat. It's
No, I didn't have my hand up. No, but I mean, I made a comment on the chat.
Oh, for Pete's sake, that's my cursor. So sorry.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, I guess on the related to instruction and the sphincter control and potty training. I mean, my comment was just that the book God and Anatomy, the author there is just trying to present just making an argument about how the physicality of God in history, his footsteps, his accompanying different individuals and presenting themselves, not as opposed to a cosmic entity that's very far away and can't be understood. So in the early religion, he had a lot of physicality. And the comment I put was that he instructed the Israelites to designate locations for their excrement, to go potty, and a process for getting rid of it. The reason was that when he walks among them, he doesn't want to step on their mess.
Yeah, that's a
That guy
humor.
must be a king. Why? He ain't got shit all over him.
Yeah, that's
Monty
a
Python.
humorous statement. Although I'm actually learning something really interesting nowadays. I was questioning this myth about Exodus. And I know that there was a lot of like weird attempts to present an evidence for Exodus coming as wildly as like some people believe literally that the ancient Jews crossed the Red Sea and it just water stopped for them. But the thing is that there is some evidence, and one of them is coming from the biblical historian who studied this, is that Israelites, Proto-Israelites, they might have never lived in Egypt, that there was a group of people who lived in the contemporary Israeli territory at the times, and they kind of came from the Canaan civilization. While there was another group of people called Semites, and they were the ones who lived in the Egypt, but they were a different group. So biblical myth teaches that the Jews left Israel to come to Canaan and live there and establish their state. But the reality might be that the prehistoric Jews, which are called Proto-Israelites, they always lived there.
So I think I'm right this time, and CJ does actually have a hand up on Zoom.
Okay. All right.
CJ, you'll need, there you go.
Yeah, I had to unmute myself. Give me a second. So I've studied animal behavior pretty much my entire life. I do have a degree in psychology with zoology as a minor for animal behavior. I was able to take comparative psychology in college with Sally Boyson. So that was just so amazing. I just find all of this so fascinating. I have observed, I've worked in zoos and aquariums all over the country, and I was at the Knoxville Zoo when Daisy, the chimpanzee, gave birth to George. And as he was growing up, she would put him on the ground, take a couple steps away, lay down on her stomach, and like do like a come here with her hands.
Okay.
And I mean, we were just like, oh my God, I mean, it was just like a human.
I'm sorry, do a what with her hands?
Like a come here, like moving her hands toward herself. Like trying to get the baby to crawl to her. And I mean, we were just like, wow, because I mean, I would consider that teaching, but I think, you know, mothers are always supposed to kind of teach the kids about how you were saying, you know, there's no teach, they don't teach each other. But it's also been observed in dolphins.
Was it a consistent behavior? Was it observed in like multiple animals or just in one?
This was just the only one that I actually saw myself. Was Daisy at the Knoxville Zoo.
It would be interesting to see if it is like a consistent behavior that it's
exactly
that's what multiple of them do, and that it's not a random thing, but like intentionality. Because like remember, there was one of the features of cautiousness, which is intentionality. So you're not only doing something, but you know what you're doing, because there could be in multiple diseases known as chorea, for example, there could be jerky movements which the person produces without intending. And that could be something similar to that. Like the question here would be, is it an intentional thing?
Okay, yeah, that kind of answers my question about the dolphins too, because this was observed in the wild, and that was like a pod of dolphins that one female picked up a sponge in her nose, because they would put their rostrums into the sand and like do the echolocation to scare the fish out of the sand. And they were getting their rostrums all like beat up. And so she grabbed a sponge to protect her rostrum, and other females started doing it. Only one male did it, and that male was a baby. So it just kind of seemed like, okay, the males really didn't care, right? They were like, nope, we're not listening to you. But the other females did it. And again, so you're right, there might not be any intention for her to teach others to do this, but they did kind of learn from her example.
I mean, basically what you're saying doesn't contradict evolution, right? Because like how the first human learned how to carve a stone, it was probably something similar to that. Someone randomly grabbed a piece from the soil and realized that it's more convenient to carve trees with a sharp stone. And then maybe someone figured that you can not only search for sharp stones, you can sharpen the stones. And that might have been how the first knife was produced. So basically what you described is like origins of evolutionary processes, when certain behavior produces better survival outcomes.
Yes.
As a result of that, it gets preserved in the species, because the species survival becomes dependent on that. So if the survival of that whale was consistently dependent on doing this kind of thing, I'm sure that they would develop like maybe a subspecies of whales which would be doing just this, and then as a result of that, that subspecies would be more successful in the evolution. Because there was a paper in 2019 published on bacteria. So what they did was they took a genus of bacteria which doesn't have any enzymes processing sugar called maltose. So they normally don't feed on that. But they placed these bacteria on the environment, on the feeding substrate, which only had maltose as a nutrient and nothing else. And what happened was, over time, a lot of bacteria died, but those which survived developed enzymes which are capable to process maltose. And as a result of that, they were able to basically acquire the feature which is not typical in their genus. Like in that genus, the way we classify bacteria is by the shape of their cell, presence of capsula, feeding method, which is including the substrates which you can or cannot digest, and other classification points. So basically, they've acquired the feature of another genus to survive.
Okay, well, thank you so much. This was such an amazing talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all
CJ, was it you that told the story in some other earlier meeting about the orangutan and turning the water on or off?
No,
Oh, okay.
I don't know that one.
I don't know if I can retell it faithfully, but it was another human-animal communication thing. It might have been at Cincinnati Zoo. Anyway, the orangutan had a habit of turning on the water, and it got to where the people could just say, I can't remember the orangutan's name, but George, turn the water back off, and he would turn it off. So, you know, some level of communication had occurred there.
Yeah.
We have a couple other hands up here, I guess. I'm not sure which came first, but
David
David's
was
first on the
first.
screen.
David was first.
Okay, thanks. Really briefly, Valeria, I was really interested by one remark you made in your discussion with CJ. That's, you know, perhaps this is one animal that discovers that, well, you can use a sharp stone to cut down a tree. It's quite another thing to learn how to sharpen stone. But now we may be talking about cultural evolution within small groups as a means of accelerating real evolution. Because it's been observed that, you know, some mothers see some activity, some members of one group learn a certain activity, teach it to members, other members of the group, and this becomes sort of like a cultural meme that might give that advantage, as that group some advantage. So it's actually the beginning of evolution, but not necessarily at the level of the genes. I find that distinction very interesting.
Yes, I think that could be a very well next step, but eventually I would think if some skill becomes so pervasive, it's, for example, you can also infer that early humans living in groups was first social evolution, but then living in groups required more complex ways of communication, and that led to the development of the speech, to the need for the speech. And the need for a speech led to different morphological features of certain frontal areas, like, for example, Broca zone, which is larger in humans than in chimpanzees. So that's a kind of, I view it as there is a social need. Then that social need produces the need for something. And then that something requires morphological change. And then if this change is beneficial for the species, it gets preserved by evolution in the form of genes, because we have now different brain features from the chimpanzees, and that means that there is a genetic difference, or at least not in the DNA sequence, but in the DNA expression, because we know that the nucleotide sequence of human / porcine / monkey genome, it's like they have 99% similarity in the plain nucleotide sequence, but the plain nucleotide sequence doesn't decide much, because it's all about which genes are being expressed.
That sounds very, very reasonable to me, but I think the thing that is very beautiful that occurs to me here is that, in a sense, the development of consciousness is autocatalytic. And
Yes,
once you have the
yes.
ability to respond to something like culture within a group, real evolution at the level of genes is accelerated.
Yes, I agree with that. It's basically could be autocatalytic, but that's that's very similar to how the first nucleic acids might have developed, because we know these ribosomes, their feature is that they can do just that they're enzymes which can induce the replication. So they have the autocatalytic feature, which means that social evolution might, in this way, kind of model or parallel the molecular evolution. And that was my thought about the future topics for the AA Society meetings. I recently, my wife bought me a gift for, I don't remember, it was New Year or my birthday. It was the integrative human biochemistry. And one of the topics there was early molecular evolution, like how the first molecular substances formed. And there were two models of that presented, and I wanted to discuss that in one of our meetups.
Are we the products of clay or are we the products of dents?
Yeah.
Let's see, Roy, I think you had your hand up
Yeah,
there.
so I want to I'm going to ask a speculative question.
Mhm.
You, for instance, described had some very interesting slides on how people think about consciousness and the various attributes. And so, for instance, one of the things I found always interesting is the concept that there are these three characteristics that are necessary. It seems to be they're described as being necessary, which is what you might call the noetic,
Mhm.
and sentience and qualia.
Yes.
So I want to relate that back to something that's become rather interesting recently, which is artificial intelligence.
Yes.
And do you think that an artificial intelligence, that intelligence really requires all those characteristics, or that's simply a description of our own of our own consciousness? In other words, that it seems to me what that model really describes is an analysis of how we operate as humans, how human consciousness works. And do you think that's absolutely necessary for all consciousness, or could we imagine a different kind of consciousness?
I think
That's
it's
why it's speculative.
Yeah, I've thought about that. And I think that it's not a different kind of consciousness, but that's kind of part. So what AI models is, for example, it could be described as an equation.
No, I'm not talking about current AI. I'm talking about AI in general. I'm not saying, let's not talk about generative, AI of today. There's no question that is not conscious.
I think that if AI once reaches a point when it can have two things, first, decision-making capacity, and second, something similar to qualia, because, for example, now you can tell AI to draw an image of something, and it would draw it, and it would look like real painting. But what it so far, to my knowledge, cannot do is, for example, tell what it thinks about the painting. So I think if AI ever becomes at the point when it can not only paint art, because like when I was small, my father told me like paint the pottery, because he wanted to test my ability to geographical and like spatial thinking. So paint a pottery, and I painted it. And that, of course, it was terrible, but I painted it. And it's what the current AI can do. But to my knowledge, what it cannot do is respond back and say, how do I feel about the painting? Do I like?
Well, yeah. So you've said, one thing you said was what I might call executive function, right?
Yes.
Decision making. And the other one is what you just described actually is sentience, right? How do I feel about the painting, not
Yeah, it is
qualia so
something,
much.
how do you feel? How do
Yeah.
you associate it with others? Like
Mhm.
not just say if this painting, if this pottery is larger than 10 other potteries, because that's what AI would be able to do just by measuring the size. But what it would not be able to say is like, would you buy that pottery not because of objective characteristics, because it can tell which pottery is better for baking
Yeah.
based
I-
upon
So I agree, I agree a certain degree of self-reflection is necessary. But again, that's a very, well, I think what you described to me is a very human interpretation. Is that really necessary for intelligence? In other words, the fact that does it have, I mean, be self-reflective about, let's say, that painting and say, how does it characterize the painting? But it doesn't necessarily have to decide whether it's beautiful or something like that in order to have a certain degree of intelligence.
But then that's a question of who makes the decision. It's all the limitations of our knowledge, because we can only compare things to ourselves, and humans think that they have the most superior consciousness. But if there is any extraterrestrial life, then probably our consciousness to them would be like to us that in this fish which I presented. So of course it all depends on who is the judge, like who you're
I've-
comparing it to.
The idea of consciousness and AI, I've wondered, speculated, right, the current AI doesn't seem to have that ability yet, but what would it take? And I wondered what would happen if you, and I can't describe this precisely, but essentially had an AI that was able to analyze, use as training data, its own thoughts per se. In other words, an AI that is able to reflect on the things that it has said, because that seems almost like a definition of consciousness. That's what I feel like I'm doing when I'm conscious.
Yes.
I am looking
Yes.
at my own thoughts and considering some.
I agree with you, and that is
Wonder if that might be a
consistent.
next AI evolution, is
Yes, I
some
totally agree with
layering
that.
of.
I totally agree with that. Yes, and it's consistent with this view of consciousness as this three-component total flight model, because that's exactly what you said. We kind of look at our own thoughts like if they were written on the paper, or equation, or algorithm, or like algorithms of action. So yes, I think that this could be an evolution in AI, if AI can learn to be aware of its own thoughts.
So the human mind itself seems like a good model. It seems to me the human mind is differentiated. That is to
Yes.
say, it has different functions somewhat in different parts of the brain, if you will.
Yes, and
Reflecting different modes of operation that are integrated together. So
yes, and coordination between multiple areas of the brain to like create a coherent image of reality.
The talk that I talk about being the human brain being a model, the talk that I gave to this group once on AI and the game of Go, and that I may be doing for Valeri's group, when I do that talk, one of my comments, and just one of my observations about the way the Go AI works is, yeah, it works very much like I do. It, I can't, it'll be take me too long to explain. I'll do the talk if you want to see it sometime again. But it really, the process it is using to explore moves in the game and think about what's more likely and what's less likely is very much like a player does.
it learns. It learns.
Yeah.
But I remember you describing the godlike move at one point that completely
Yes,
threw off.
Lee Sedol, yeah, one of the early AI Go played the first time it played a professional level, I think. Lee Sedol was sort of the one that did the Kasparov of the Go world. And yeah, it was a 4 out of 5 game series, and Lee Sedol did win one game because he made the godlike move, made a move, and the AI clearly did not know what to do with it. Its game just sort of completely fell apart, which was sort of interesting as well.
Yes.
There's an old science fiction story about a very sophisticated computer on each side of a battle. And eventually one side wins because they let a madman loose in the control room, and he starts acting irrationally enough that the opponent doesn't know what to do with the moves. It sounds like a little bit of that going on with this Go game.
So to be an opportunity for insert one of the comments from the chat. Was David? Roll up. Yeah, Dave said, if you consider the characteristics of AI and project them onto human, we call them psychopaths. He can't get his head around getting advice from a psychopath. Taking advice from current AIs at your own risk, I think, is the message there.
Noam Chomsky made a great comment about AIs as they are now. I think in some article he wrote that AI as it is now is sort of like a very sophisticated autocomplete. You know, and I think that's right. It can only answer in terms of what a lot of people have said under somewhat similar circumstances.
I think I actually didn't agree with him. So I think there's, the question becomes at what level you say it's that, or it has a certain rudiments of understanding. And it almost comes down to a definitional question, which is if I have a fairly sophisticated question with a number of different aspects and it answers in kind to what I said, there's a certain level of understanding there, a certain level of knowing how to actually grasp the various components of what I said and to put them together in order to give me the right answer. And so, I mean, it comes back to that question, is that conscious? No. But can I describe that as having a certain level of understanding? Yeah, I think I could. It's the rudiments of understanding.
I wouldn't call them rudiments, because if something is rudimentary, then from the terminology perspective, that means that there was a creature before, which later became a different species, but we have leftovers of that.
Rudiment just means it's the early essentials or the beginnings or the
if you did describe it this way, then yes, I would agree.
Yeah.
It would be rudimentary.
So I read that thing or listened to that thing by Chomsky, and I thought he was a little bit too negative, I guess. Is what I'm saying.
I wish I could have read that article. It was behind a paywall. It looked like a very interesting article you guys were passing.
I mean, the basic point was that his basic point was people are making too much of this, and he described how
Chomsky, like his whole thing is universal language, and you're pointing out in this talk the anatomy of the brain, where there are areas of the brain that are enlarged, and I hadn't heard this before today, but the Broca's asymmetrically enlarged in the left hemisphere, which makes some sense. That's not a detail I knew before. But his whole thing was that humans are hardwired for learning language. We don't learn language like we learn other skills. That there is actually wiring in the brain that is language specific.
Yes.
Was one of his big points. And so I can see where he's, the AI is still learning generally.
Steve,
I don't know if that was brought up in the article or not, because I couldn't see it. But
Steve Roy, I think his basic point, Chomsky's basic point, was that and Valeria's too as well, is that it's not real cognition as you and I would say it, because there's the parable of the prisoner who's given Chinese texts and told he must, translate Chinese texts, and through an immense amount of trial and error, finally learns that when he sees a certain Chinese character, he should use a certain English word. This symbol represents that one. He does not, in what sense does he understand Chinese?
But the AI is doing more than that. The AI is not doing a table lookup. It is machine learning.
It's an
And a neural-
experience. The point taken, Steve, but the point is, does AI in a sense know in terms of being able to represent external objects what that word means? It just knows that that word is frequently used in the following context.
That's all I know.
And we're back to qualia.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
That's what
true.
you're describing as qualia, you know, is the. Is
But
having
that's
some
all I know. Again, back to
perception.
the AI Go thing. It is learning the best moves. It is learning the patterns in the same way I do. And it is not just a table lookup, this pattern good, this pattern bad. It is
Oh,
a much more networked association, neurally networked association.
let me respectfully question you there. You say it's
sure.
not table lookup, but the AI is trained on volumes and volumes and volumes of text. So essentially it is, it's saying usually this word is followed by these three others.
It's not table lookup in the sense of a function. This input provides this output. It
And-
is, there are associations rather than functions, might be one way I would say it.
If I substitute the word probability function for that, it's a mathematical expression.
I think what David means, the way I understand this Chinese example, is, for example, you can teach someone that the stove is associated with a warmer food. And that's similar to me, like this prisoner had learned that that word is associated with the Chinese symbol. And that's one level of understanding. That's what I would call associative memory. But then the next level of understanding is to actually realize what is the stove and why it makes food warm. And that would be if you really know language, if you just not just know that this symbol means that because you learned to associate it, but you have the whole understanding of the concept, like the big picture thing.
Well, David, I forget, how did Chomsky make that how did his example make that association? After all, ultimately, the only way I can really believe that association is correct because I make enough of them such that what comes out of all that in English makes sense, quote unquote, whatever it makes sense means, you know.
That paradox is the point, right?
It's a consistent system within more than just the one word. So
No, that paradox is the point. At
Yeah,
what
and
point is
I know,
language on the lookup table?
right, I know, and so I'm certainly not arguing that something like a ChatGPT is at all artificial intelligence, but it has certain aspects.
I agree with you. I find it sort of spooky that they're, at least according to this way of thinking, I think Valeria has pointed out that this way of thinking is a bit limited, but according to this way of thinking, there is no sharp division.
Yeah, well, or so another way is for me to say it, and I'm reading a little off of your topic of discussion, but the other way I'd say it is, it seems almost inconceivable to me that we've gotten this far with this neural network approach. And so one has to wonder if they can take the next, leap in size of neural networks. How will that react? How will that act?
Networks observing networks.
AI-based networks are now chillingly good at translating Chinese into other languages. I used to get patent translations, say example from Japanese, which sounded like a fever dream. You can now get translations that are done by machine, which you actually recognize is related to the topic. That's pretty good.
So David, to your point about being mathematical, yes, that's true. I mean, the math underneath the neural network is surprisingly simple. It's just weights on the paths and a weight on the bias on the neuron. I suppose I still bristle a little at table lookup because to me that is literally just a function, this input, that output, this. Okay, if you put a whole bunch of functional table lookups together and neurally network them, yeah, that's different. But to me, that's the point I'm making, is that it's that neural networking. I still draw a distinction between that and a simple table lookup, I guess.
it certainly isn't a one-to-one correspondence.
No,
It's true.
It's modeled off of neurons in the human brain, or at least
Yes.
in the eye, I think originally.
Yes,
Mhm.
it's all math.
So I
That's why
see
I'm a math
an
teacher.
interesting point in the comment. I was AI, no empathy, no guilt. So it sounds like someone is trying to kind of contradict AI and guilt. But, you know, guilt, the feeling of guilt can be brought down to mechanistic things too. For example, today we feel guilty for things which not even prehistoric humans, but Homo sapienses from other epochs wouldn't. And I'm not bringing up this Albigensian crusade in vain, because this was relatively recent times. Yes, it was Middle Ages, but at this time people already had notaries, people had doctors, they had social activities, they definitely had developed speech, to the point that Occitania had multiple dialects of French, and the North had a different language. So they were developed enough, they were definitely sentient, and yet at these times it was considered that it is the right thing to burn a heretic, because their belief was that if your soul is not saved, then you're going to the eternal torment. And when you're burning down the heretic, you're doing a good thing, because you are cleansing the society from the wrong thoughts which lead people to the hell. So the guilt also is an algorithm, and it depends on how parents teach a child, because, you know, there are still nomadic tribes, there are still cannibalistic tribes which live just now. They are not in the past, they are in contemporary times. They're just in the geographical areas which were left behind by the progress, and therefore values there are taught differently, and their guilt is not comparable to our guilt, because they feel guilty for different things. They might feel guilty for not eating their grandfather's brain, because in their understanding, when you eat the grandfather's brain, you acquire capacities of the grandfather. That's where this Christian ceremony of eating bread and drinking wine for the body of Jesus Christ came from. So I wouldn't contradict, I wouldn't like oppose concepts of AI with the concepts of guilt, because guilt basically is an AI mechanism instilled into us when we're growing up.
So I just heard just yesterday, I think it was on Science Friday. They were talking about the Chat GTP, and you know you've probably, many of us have probably heard about the bizarre behaviors where one was trying to talk him into divorcing his wife, and they cited in this one apparently an example where someone speaking to an AI was convinced to end his own life. Like you said, don't take advice from psychotics. But what they were doing for a new round of training, which I found totally fascinating, is they would run the AI, the moderators would run with the AI, and each time it said something that was well, unseemly, it would say bad dog. And you know, when they would provide responses that were okay, it would say good dog. And the AI learned to be a better dog, and not bring up such crazy ideas. And it really occurred to me, okay, innate versus learned behavior. Are we now doing that with AI? The innate behavior is to maybe say and think about some crazy stuff, but we are taught out of it. And that's exactly what they were doing with that version of the AI that they were developing.
Likewise, empathy. Empathy is also totally
Trained behavior.
mechanistical. Like if you think about different civilizations, okay, so here we think that dogs are family members, but in China, they're considered as food. And likewise, there is another difference. For example, here we eat steak and cows are food, but if you kill a sacred cow in India, they might kill you, because for them it's a sacred animal, which has certain spiritual importances. So empathy is also, it's like guilt, it's a social construct. You are taught who to empathize with and who not to empathize with.
Oh, I
Because
don't know. Whoa, 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 whoa. I understand what you just said, sure, but the I think that empathy or an altruism as what's the word I want to use for this? As tendencies are built in. Now,
Oh,
what you're
sure,
really
yes.
what you're describing is that there's a certain degree of learning about who we are empathetic with,
Yes,
or who
yes.
we are altruistic to. But
100%, but that's the
Okay,
same. Like legs
okay.
are built in, like you have Hox genes which determine the body segmentation, but without learning how to run, even if you have legs, you're not going to run. So the same thing here. Yes, I agree with you that
Okay.
probably some sort of empathy is built, however, is built in, however, it also, I would say that the degree, not even the structure of empathy, but even the degree of empathy can be different, because if people are constantly exposed to higher levels of cruelty, they have choice of either perish or adapt and learn not to empathize too much with others. Because if you keep empathizing with, you know, people in times when there was like human sacrifice, then if you truly choose to empathize with all of them, you're going to go crazy, which means that you're going to fall out of the social norms. So I would say that not only shapes of empathy, like who to empathize with, but also even the degrees of empathies which the person can afford depend on the technological development of the society. Because when the society depends on, either slave trade or slave labor, you learn not to empathize with a large group of people.
Mhm.
Because if you empathize with them, you will have to either live with an internal conflict inside you all the time, and that's very hard. That's why I left Russia, because I realized that I have nothing in common with these people. And I just discovered the founding fathers. And I think one other thing I'm going to be doing on the meetup group, if people agree, I would like to talk about their biographies and like their writings and diaries, because I think it's a very important thing. And I'm fascinated with how today's culture says terrible things about them, that like they were these white slave owning cisgender males. Come on, present
I mean,
me
they
as
were all of those things.
it's
but-
like when I hear this, I just want to facepalm, because it's crazy. Like, okay, you are pointing out that they weren't perfect according to the today's moral statements. But are these people aware that, for example, Chinese emperors had 1,000 girls harems? Like these girls in these harems didn't have any rights; they were property.
Valeria, you've now taken on many forms of the culture. You might as well take on another one at the risk of offending somebody. I mean, I was brought up Jewish, but for me, a perfect embodiment of this idea is now to read Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, because
Yes.
it postulates so many things as positive goods that now would get you arrested.
Yes, like for
It's in
example,
felonies.
the story of Moses, because basically if you believe that story, I don't think it's real. I think it's a myth. And I
Yeah, I
stand
do
with
too.
this historical evidence that they were just proto-Israelites, which either derived from Canaan people or were living in parallel with them. But the way the myth teaches is that basically Moses came to Canaan and committed a genocide there. They just like killed all of the people who lived there and destroyed their temples and their culture and took this place for themselves. And this is a terrible thing to say, because that sounds very disturbing, but that would mean that the ancient Jews did exactly what later Nazis did to them. And I don't think it's real. I think it's a nonsensical story, like most of these patriotical fairy tales just propagandized to people. But like back to the question, even I don't think that the like shape of empathy, but even the degree of empathy is important. And I think that the capacity of empathy increases as the society has less and less need for exploitation of other human beings.
It really depends on who in that society is a person.
Yes.
So in the case you described, right, about slaves or something, the way of dealing with that was very simple. They're not really people.
Yeah, they're not really people, and therefore you don't have to
Right.
empathize with them, or you
So-
have.
I'm sure AI feels the same way.
Bad dog, bad dog.
And there's always Hal.
Yeah. Well, this was fantastic. I don't know if we want to keep going where we usually end somewhere around or shortly afternoon.
Thank you so much.
I want to take up all of your
Thank you.
day.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This was very interesting.
Yeah,
Thank
very good.
And I think you've come up with a lot of topics for future discussions.
Yes, definitely, definitely. I think we're gonna look into ways to record our AA meetings and present them as
Speaking of which, I will stop recording here.